Yes, good morning, folks. We're taking a look at this coming Sunday, which is the second Sunday of Lent. And it reminds me of with our men's group on Tuesday morning, and we were talking a little bit about religious experience. It's many intense religious experience where you feel the presence of God in a very intense way. And obviously, it doesn't happen all the time. Uh, for example, we got some people. Some descriptions of it would be like some people talked about about retreat, especially Cursillo movement, Cursillo weekend, where they really during the course of the weekend they really felt the presence of God in a very real way. For other people, talked about the birth of their first child as again just to see that little beautiful created baby, how it can really touch their hearts in a very real way. Other people talked about going to the beach in the evening time when the sun is sort of beginning to set, and how that can be a very intense experience of God's presence. Also, other people talked about being in the woods and feeling God's presence in a special way. Other people talked about they've never really felt the presence of God in a very powerful way. And also, if you may recall, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, toward the end of her life, in some of her writings, she said, even though she's been doing all the powerful outreach in relationship to broken people, and praying a lot, but sometimes she didn't feel that intense presence of God for long periods of time. So that, in a sense, it's a good time to think about that in relationship to our own lives, and in relationship to whether or not we can have that kind of an experience during the Lenten season. And that's why today's gospel reading, I think, is very, very special in that regard, where Peter, James, and John went up the mountain with Jesus, and Jesus had just had already spoken to them about the fact that he was going to suffer and die. So they were probably beginning to perhaps feel a little bit bit of a struggle in their lives about what was his call all about, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, the experience on top of the mountain, anytime in Scripture, anytime you find yourself on top of a mountain, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, usually it's a meeting place of God and man, where God's presence is felt in a special way. And certainly that was true in this instance for Peter, James, and John. We're told actually in the Scripture, it says he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared with him. So it was almost like for them, it was almost like as if the veil was pulled back, or curtain was pulled back, and they saw this intense experience of God's presence. And the voice from the heavens said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And Peter's immediate response was, let's build 3 tabernacles here: one for you, Jesus; one for Moses; and one for Elijah. And needless to say, it didn't happen, because the reason it didn't happen, I suppose, because what Peter wanted to do was he wanted to freeze a moment. He wanted to hold on to it. But that's the problem with the religious experience, is it doesn't last. It's a temporary thing, and so as you know yourselves, life is not lived on top of the mountain. Most of life is lived in the muck, down in the valley, where we're challenged and struggle every day. And so we find that that's what happened in this instance, that very soon Peter, James, and John with Jesus had to come down the mountain. Now, for them, if it was an intense religious experience, it seems as if they didn't talk about it as soon as they came down. In fact, Jesus told them not to talk about it until he had risen from the dead. And certainly after he rose from the dead, for them it was certainly perhaps easy for them to put 2 and 2 together and realize that already seen Jesus in this almost like I had already seen Jesus in his resurrected state, even though he was still human form. So that, in a sense, I think that leads all of us to take this Lenten season very seriously, continue to do what we're doing. If we haven't had a religious experience during this Lenten season, remember it's only the second Sunday of Lent, and our first Sunday of Lent, so we have second Sunday of Lent, so we have a long ways to go. And I think that, like the first reading today, talked about God's presence to Abraham way back then, and that telling Abraham he'd be with him and with his people. Well, that same God who 2,000 years ago, several thousand years ago, spoke to Abraham, he is still with us, and he is still with us in the person of Jesus. And if we continue to do our very best during this Lenten season to fulfill our Lenten obligations, my hope and my prayer is that, if it hasn't happened already, that sometime during this Lenten season that we'll experience the presence of God in our lives in a very intense and beautiful way. Amen.